Good to see you guys. And those of you who are joining us online, we're glad you're here today. We're going to continue a series called From the Wall to Our Hearts. And it's about the Ten Commandments. And it's about, it's important not to hang them on the wall, but to make sure that we have them in our heart. And the other thing is we're looking at them from a positive point of view. Instead of just thou shalt not, what are they saying that we should do? Because following God is not about just what you don't do. It's about what we do. And so we're going to look at these commandments and look at the goal that they're actually pointing to. What are they telling us is important? And we've done two already. The first one was put God first. We rephrased it to say put God first. The second one, accept no substitutes. And so let's say those two together, all right? Put God first. Let's try it again. Ready? Put God first, accept no substitutes. Okay, those are the first two. And today, here's the third one that's found in verse 7 of chapter 20. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for whoever takes the name of God in vain, God will not hold innocent. We all heard it mostly as, thou shalt not take God's name in vain. But if we turn that around and look at it from a positive perspective, how about we rephrase it like this? Understand the power of a name. Because that's what it's really about. That's what it's really saying, is to understand the power of a name. I think that's a lot better. When I was growing up, I was taught this verse meant don't cuss. And that may be what you've been taught your whole life. This verse means don't cuss. Don't use God's name in a curse word. But it's about a lot more than that. The way I learned it was they taught me, don't drink, cuss, smoke, or chew, or run around with girls who do. That's what I learned. But I don't think that's what this verse is about. What does it mean to take God's name in vain? Or better yet, what does it mean to understand the power of a name? What does that mean for us? And there's at least three ways that I want to mention that I think it applies to us today. And the first one is, I think it's telling us to use encouraging language. I mean, a part of this verse is, don't use God's name flippantly and meaninglessly, but, have some respect, for God's name. And then it also, a part of it for them was not to invoke God's name in an oath. People, if they're saying something, they don't think you're going to believe them, they'll say, I swear to God it's true, or, by God's name this is true. And they were kind of saying, don't do that, because just tell the truth. And then you don't have to swear by anything. People just know you're telling the truth because you tell the truth. Don't swear by God's name or on a stack of Bibles or any of that stuff. Just tell the truth. And we'll talk about that a little later on. And then the second thing is don't use God's name for harm. That's a part of what this is about. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, God's name is Yahweh. When Moses went to the mountain and God told him he wanted him to go back to Egypt and set his people free, Moses said, well, if they ask me who sent me, who shall I tell them sent me? And if you're familiar with that story in English, Moses says, who shall I tell them? And in English, we say, tell them I am that I am sent you. It's because we don't know how to translate that word. The word, though, is Yahweh. And that word came to be known as God's name. And so in an English Bible or on your phone, whenever in the Hebrew text, whenever there's the word Yahweh, it's translated in English as Lord, all caps. That's why sometimes you see the word Lord, it's all caps. That means that was actually God's name. But they didn't want to print it, so they put it in all caps. And so it means not taking God's name, not taking the name Yahweh in vain, not making God's name meaningless or useful. useless, not making it, just making it not mean anything. As a matter of fact, our Jewish friends are so cautious about this that in order to not take God's name in vain, they won't say God's name. So if you go to a synagogue and they're reading their scripture, they're reading it in Hebrew, but if they come to that name, they will say Lord. They will not say the name. Because one way you cannot abuse the name is just not say the name. And so they don't say it at all. And that is the tradition that led the English tradition of using Lord, all caps, to whenever that word, you see that word, that was God's name was there. Now, the reason that I bother to explain this to you is because in ancient times, if you knew someone's name, then it made them available to you. It kind of gave you power with them. Kind of like today, if you give somebody your phone number, now they can call you. You gave them a way to get in touch with you. And so if you knew somebody's name, then you had an in with them. You could call on them. And so a part of this is, that God has entered into a relationship with us. And God has given us his name so that we can call on God and know that God listens and that God hears. I like the way Frederick Buechner put it. He said, in the book of Exodus, God tells Moses his name is Yahweh, and God hasn't had a peaceful moment since. Once they get your number, they keep calling it. And once God gave us his name, then God became accessible to us. Now, a great example of this is a story some of you may be familiar with. When Jacob was making his way back home, and he camped out in a tent by the river Jabbok, or the brook, and while he was asleep, someone jumped on him in the middle of the night. And he ends up wrestling with this stranger in the night. And Jacob, while they're wrestling with one another, Jacob says, "What is your name?" Yeah, that's weird. You should laugh. Why would you say that? I mean, imagine you're laying in your bed asleep, 2 a.m, somebody slips into your house, jumps on you in your bed, and you start wrestling with them, and you roll over to the floor. You're not going to say, "Oh, by the way, what's your name?" We wouldn't do that. Jacob did that because they believed if you knew somebody's name, you had power with them. And so Jacob was looking for an edge, any edge he could find. If I could know his name, then there's power in knowing someone's name. And then, back in the day, they believed that if you pronounced a blessing on someone and you did it in God's name, then you were calling on God's power to make that blessing really happen. And if you cursed someone in God's name, then you were relying on the power of God to make that curse happen. And people did this. And a part of this commandment is, don't use God's name in a curse in a way that harms other people. Don't use God's name for that. Now, to us, that sounds superstitious, kind of silly. We don't do that. But this really applies to us in a very powerful way. Because both in our society and in the church, people have used the power of God's name to do harm to other people. There are charlatans who are making themselves rich and doing damage to God's name. And as they do that, while they preach their prosperity gospel, they harm God's name to the people who hear it. How many adults are in therapy right now because parents or some preacher somewhere in God's name told them that they were sinners worth nothing but hell, and they're still trying to figure out who they are? That's using God's name for harm. How many people have used God's name to tell others they have to deny who they are to serve God? That's using God's name for harm. How many people have been abused and harmed by clergy who were bearing God's name when they harmed them? And then they used God's name when they covered it up. Just think of all the violence through the years, from the Crusades down to all the judgment and condemnation. That was all done in God's name, and all the harm that's done. And there are politicians who want to tie God's name to their ideology and their agenda, their party, their whatever. Just like we talked about Christian nationalism and how that is taking God's name in vain. When we take God's name and use it for harm, it does damage. A pastor uses God's name to tell a woman she has to stay in an abusive relationship. Christian groups make statements condemning people in God's name. These are statements that do harm, not good. And all of these examples, illustrate ways that we can use God's name to do harm, that we can use God's name to damage people. And that's what this is about. Don't use God's name for harm. Use God's name for good. Use God's name for health. Use God's name to help make people whole. Don't use God's name to do harm to people. Whenever we use God's name in a way that harms others, we're breaking the third commandment. And then the third application is more personal. A hero of mine, a guy named Clarence Jordan, said that the only people that can take God's name in vain are the people who've taken God's name. So that means if we've taken God's name, like the name Christian, and we go by that name, we're the only ones that can take that name in vain. When we were baptized, we took that name. And it means that now our name is Christian, and so we're supposed to wear that name and live in a way that reminds people of Jesus and how Jesus lived and how Jesus loved. And if we take that name, God's name, if we take that name Christian upon ourselves, and we don't do our best with God's help to live the way that Jesus lived, then we've taken the name in vain. We've taken it in a way that's meaningless and useless. All of us have a family name, and some of us resemble our family. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but this has happened to me several times actually in my life. I'll just give you one example. But we were living in Atlanta, and my family, is just over in Jasper in Alabama. And someone in my family passed away, and so I made the trek back over to go to the service, the viewing the night before and the funeral the next day. And the funeral home they chose happened to be in a part of the county I had not been to in 2 or 3 decades. And I got there, and it was a huge funeral home, and they had like several different viewings going on at the same time. And so when I walked in, the funeral director looked up and saw me, and he said, "Lorene's viewing is down this hall. It's the second door on the left." And I said, "How did you know I was coming for Lorene?" And he said, "Well, you're a Pratt, aren't you?" He said, "You're Themer's boy." You see, my father's name was Ennis Themer Pratt, and he went by Themer. What can I say? We're from Alabama. But that's what he said to me. He said, "You're Themer's boy. I can see the resemblance. I know who you are." And I thought about stories like that as I thought about this third commandment. And I think that a large part is that if we take this name upon ourselves, then we ought to resemble each other, and we ought to resemble the one whose name we took. Our lives should remind people of God. I think there ought to be times in our life when someone walks up and says, "You're God's child, aren't you?" Yesterday at work when that guy blew up at you, and you handled him with such grace, and you didn't get angry and impatient, and later when he came back, you forgave him. The way you acted, your name's Christian, isn't it? I've met people in your family before. I see the resemblance. You remind me of who God is. I think there's times when somebody will walk up and say, hey, you're God's girl, aren't you? I mean, I've been watching how you live and how you treat people with love and with kindness. You remind me so much of your father when you do that. You make me think of him. I can see this family resemblance. You must be in God's family. You know, it actually happened once in the New Testament. They took an innocent man named Jesus, and they brought him out, and they laid him on a cross. And as they drove spikes through his arms into the wood, he said, Father, forgive them. And when they hung him up on a cross, he gave nothing but love and sacrifice for the very people who did this to him. And Mark says, the Gospel of Mark says there was a Roman soldier who was standing nearby, and he looked up and said, surely this is the Son of God. If that Roman soldier had been where I'm from, he would have said, that's God's boy. I can see the resemblance because nobody ever loved us like that except God. So you see, this isn't about don't cuss. This is about if we take the name Christian, we take the name of God upon ourselves. And if we refuse then to live in a way that is like Jesus and that honors Jesus, then we have taken that name in vain. We've made it meaningless. That's what this word is all about. But if we live as best we can with God's help, we take that name and do our best to honor that name by treating people like Jesus treats people, by caring about people the way Jesus cares about people, then people start to see in us the image of God. They see the family resemblance for the name that we carry. And who knows? One day somebody may walk up to you and say, hey, you're God's child, aren't you? See, I see the way you treat people. I see the way you care about other folks. I see the family resemblance. You must be Christian. Dear God, I hope that happens. I really hope that happens. Amen.